Hello and welcome back for another speedy read of Phillip Pullman's classic Northern Lights. We're episode number 11 and we'll pick it straight up with what's going on with Lyra and the Egyptians. Here we go. Oh no, but we've got 60 minutes to see how far we can get. So I'm going to press that. That'll let us know when to stop. When my mouth stops working. All right, so here we go. And now, by 1,000 winding channels and creeks and watercourses, Egyptian boats were moving in towards the Bayernplatz, the only patch of slightly higher ground in the hundreds of square miles of marsh and bog. There was an ancient wooden meeting hall there, with a huddle of permanent dwellings around it, and wharves and jetties, and an eel market. When a Bayan roping was called, a summons or muster of Egyptians, so many boats filled the waterways that you could walk for a mile in any direction over their decks, or so it was said. The Egyptians ruled in the fens. No one else dared enter. And while the Egyptians kept the peace and traded fairly, the landlopers turned a blind eye to the incessant smuggling and occasional feuds. If the Egyptian body floated ashore down the coast or got snagged in a fishnet, well, it was only Egyptian. Lyra listened enthralled to the tales of the fen dwellers, of the great ghost dog Black Shuck, of the marsh fires arising from the bubbles of witch oil, and began to think of herself as Egyptian even before they reached the fens. She soon slipped back into her Oxford voice, and now she was acquiring Egyptian one, complete with fen Dutch words. Ma Costa had to remind her of a few things. You ain't Egyptian, Lyra. You might pass for Egyptian with practice, but there's more to us than Egyptian language. There's deeps in us and strong currents. We're water people through, and you ain't. You're a fire person. What you're most like is marsh fire. That's the place you have in Egyptian scheme. You got witch oil in your soul. Deceptive. That's what you are, child. Lyra was hurt. I ain't never deceived anyone. You ask... Well, there was no one to ask, of course, and Ma Costa laughed, but kindly. Can't you see I'm paying you a compliment, you goslin? She said, and Lyra was pacified, though she didn't understand. When they reached the Bayernplatz, it was evening, and the sun was about to set in a splash of bloody sky. The low island and the Zaal were humped blackly against the lights, like the clustered buildings around. Threads of smoke rose into the still air, and from the press of boats all around came the smells of frying fish, of smoked leaf, of Geneva spirit. They tied up close to the Zaal itself. At a mooring, Tony said, had been used by their family for generations. Presently, Ma Costa had the frying pan going, with a couple of fat eels hissing and spluttering, and the kettle on for potato powder. Tony and Kerim oiled their hair, put on their finest leather jackets and blue spotted neckerchiefs, loaded their fingers with silver rings, and went to greet some old friends in the neighbouring boats and drink a glass or two at the nearest bar. They came back with important news. We got here just in time. The roping's this very night. And they're saying in the town, what do you think of this? They're saying that the missing child's on an Egyptian boat, and she's going to appear tonight at the roping. He laughed loudly and ruffled Lyra's hair. Ever since they'd entered the fens, he had been more and more good-tempered, as if the savage gloom his face showed outside were only a disguise. And Lyra felt an excitement growing in her breast as she ate quickly and washed the dishes before combing her hair, tucking the alethiometer into the wolfskin coat pocket and jumping ashore with all the other families, making their way up the slope to the Zaal. She had thought Tony was joking. She soon found out that he wasn't. Or else that she looked less like Egyptian than she had thought, for many people stared and children pointed, and by the time they reached the great doors of the Zaal, they were walking alone between a crowd on either side who had fallen back to stare and give them room. And then Lyra began to feel truly nervous. She kept close to Ma Costa, and Pantalaimon became as big as he could and took his panther shape to reassure her. Ma Costa trudged up the steps as if nothing in the world could possibly either stop her or make her go more quickly, and Tony and Kerim walked proudly on either side like princes. The hall was lit by naphtha lamps, which shone brightly enough on the faces and bodies of the audience, but left the lofty rafters hidden in the darkness. The people coming in had to struggle to find room on the floor, where the benches were already crowded, but families squeezed up to make space, children occupying laps, and demons curling up underfoot or perching out of the way on the rough wooden walls. At the front of the Zal, there was a platform with 8 carved wooden chairs set out. As Lyra and the Costas found space to stand along the edge of the hall, but there was nowhere left to sit, 8 men appeared from the shadows at the rear of the platform and stood in front of the chairs. A ripple of excitement swept over the audience as they hushed one another and shoved themselves into spaces on the nearest bench. Finally, there was silence, and 7 of the men on the platform sat down. The one who remained was in his 70s, but tall, bull-necked and powerful. He wore a plain canvas jacket and a checked shirt like many Egyptian men. There was nothing to mark him out but the air of strength and authority he had. Lyra recognized it. Uncle Asriel had it, and so did the Master of Jordan. This man's demon was a crow, very like the Master's raven. "That's John Farr, the Lord of the Western Egyptians," Tony whispered. John Farr began to speak in a deep, slow voice. "Egyptians, welcome to the roping. We've come to listen and come to decide. You all know why. There are many families here who have lost a child. Some are lost too. Someone is taking them. To be sure, landlopers are losing children too. We have no quarrel with landlopers over this. Now there's been talk about a child and a reward. Here's truth to stop all gossip. This child's name is Lyra Belacqua, and she's been sought by the landloper police. There is a reward of 1,000 sovereigns for giving her up to them. She's a landloper child, and she's in their care, and she's going to stay. Anyone tempted by those 1,000 sovereigns had better find a place neither on land nor on water. We ain't giving her up." Lyra felt a blush from the roots of her hair to the soles of her feet. Pantalaimon became a brown moth to hide. Eyes all around were turning to them, and she could only look up at Mar Costa for reassurance. But John Farr was speaking again. "Talk all we may, we won't change out. We must act if we want to change things. Here's another fact for you. The gobblers, these child thieves, are taking their prisoners to a town in the far north, way up in the land of dark. I don't know what they do with them there. Some folks say they kill them, other folks say different. We don't know. What we do know is that they do it with the help of the landloper police and the clergy. Every pair on land is helping them. Remember that. They know what's going on, and they'll help it whenever they can. So what I'm proposing ain't easy, and I need your agreement. I'm proposing we send a band of fighters up north to rescue them kids and bring them back alive. I'm proposing that we put our gold into this and all the craft and courage we can muster." "Yes, Raymond Van Garrett?" A man in the audience had raised his hand, and John Farr sat down to let him speak. "Beg pardon, Lord Farr. There's landloper kids as well as Egyptians been taken captive. Are you saying we should rescue them as well?" John Farr stood up to answer. "Raymond, are you saying we should fight our way through every kind of danger to a little group of frightened children, and then say to some of them that they can come home, and to the rest that they have to stay? No, you're a better man than that. Well, do I have your approval, friends?" The question caught them by surprise, for there was a moment's hesitation, but then a full-throated roar filled the hall, and hands were clapped in the air, fists shaken, voices raised in excited clamour. The rafters of the Zal shook, and from their perches up in the dark, a score of sleeping birds woke up in fear and flapped their wings, and little showers of dust drifted down. John Farr let the noise continue for a minute, and then raised his hand for silence again. "This'll take a while to organise. I want the heads of the families to raise a tax and muster a levy. We'll meet again here in 3 days. In between now and then, I'm going to talk with the child I mentioned before, and with Farr Decorum, and form a plan to put before you when we meet. Good night to you all." His massive, plain, blunt presence was enough to calm them. As the audience began to move out of the great doors into the chilly evening to go to their boats or to crowded bars of the little settlement, Lyra said to Mar Costa, "Who are the other men on the platform?" "The heads of the 6 families, and the other man is Farr Decorum." It was easy to see who she meant by the other man, because he was the oldest one there. He walked with a stick, and all the time he'd been sitting behind John Farr, he'd been trembling as if with an ague. "Come on," said Tony. I'll take you up to pay your respects to John Farr. You call him Lord Farr. I don't know what you'll be asked, but mind you tell the truth." Pantalaimon was a sparrow now, and sat curiously on Lyra's shoulder, his claws deep in the wolfskin coat, as she followed Tony through the crowd up to the platform. He lifted her up, knowing that everyone still in the hall was staring at her, and conscious of those 1,000 sovereigns she was suddenly worth. She blushed and hesitated. Pantalaimon darted to her breast and became a wildcat, sitting up in her arms and hissing softly as he looked around. Lyra felt a push and stepped forward to John Farr. He was stern and massive and expressionless, more like a pillar of rock than a man, but he stooped and held out his hand to shake. When she put hers in, it nearly vanished. "Welcome, Lyra," he said. Close to, she felt his voice rumbling like the earth itself. She would have been nervous but for Pantalaimon and the fact that John Farr's stony expression had warmed a little. He was treating her very gently. "Thank you, Lord Farr," she said. "Now, you come in the parley room and we'll have a talk," said John Farr. "Have they been feeding you proper, the costers?" "Oh, yes, we had eels for supper." "Proper fen eels, I expect." The parley room was a comfortable place with a big fire sideboards laden with silver and porcelain, and a heavy table darkly polished by the years at which 12 chairs were drawn up. The other men from the platform had gone elsewhere, but the old shaking man was still with them. John Farr helped him to a seat at the table. "Now, you sit here on my right," John Farr said to Lyra, and took the chair at the head of the table himself. Lyra found herself opposite Farr Dacorum. She was a little frightened by his skull-like face and his continual trembling. His demon was a beautiful autumn-coloured cat, massive in size, who stalked along the table with upraised tail and elegantly inspected Pantalaimon, touching noses briefly before settling on Farr Dacorum's lap, half closing her eyes and purring softly. A woman whom Lyra hadn't noticed came out of the shadows with a tray of glasses, set it down by John Farr, curtsied and left. John Farr poured little glasses of Geneva from a stone crock for himself and Farr Dacorum, and wine for Lyra. "So," John Farr said, "you run away, Lyra?" "Yes." "And who was the lady you run away from?" "She was called Mrs. Coulter, and I thought she was nice, but I found out she was one of the gobblers. I heard someone say what the gobblers were. They were called the General Oblation Board, and she was in charge of it. It was all her idea. And they was working on some plan. I don't know what it was, only they was going to make me help her get kids for 'em. But they never knew." "They never knew what?" "Well, first they never knew that I knew some kids what got took. My friend Roger, the kitchen boy from Jordan College, and Billy Costa, and a girl out the covered market in Oxford. And another thing, my uncle, right, Lord Asriel, I heard them talking about his journeys to the north, and I don't reckon he's got anything to do with the gobblers, because I spied on the master and the scholars of Jordan, right? I hid in the retiring room when no one's supposed to go except them, and I heard him tell them all about his expedition up north and the dust he saw, and he brought back the head of Stanislaus Grumman, what the Tartars have made a hole in, and now the gobblers have got him locked up somewhere. The armoured bears are guarding him, and I want to rescue him." She looked fierce and stubborn as she sat there, small against the high carved back of the chair. The two old men couldn't help smiling, but whereas Farr Dacorum's smile was hesitant, rich, complicated expression that trembled across his face like sunlight chasing shadows on a windy March day, John Farr's smile was slow, warm, plain and kindly. "You better tell us what you did hear your uncle say that evening," said John Farr. "Don't leave anything out, mind. Tell us everything." Lyra did, more slowly than she'd told the Costas, but more honestly too. She was afraid of John Farr, and what she was most afraid of was his kindness. When she'd finished, Farr Dacorum spoke for the first time. His voice was rich and musical, with as many tones in it as there were colours in his demon's fur. "This dust," he said. "Did they ever call it anything else, Lyra?" "No, just dust. Mrs. Coulter told me what it was, elementary particles, but that's all she called it. And they think that by doing something to children, they can find out more about it. Yeah, but I don't know what, except my uncle. Oh, there's something I forgot to tell you. When he was showing them lantern slides, there was another one he had. It was the Aurora? The what? The Aurora, said Father Coram. Is that right, Lyra? Yeah, that's it. And in the lights of the Aurora, there was like a city, all towers and churches and domes and that. It was a bit like Oxford. Well, that's what I thought anyway. And Uncle Asriel, he was more interested in that, I think. But the master and the other scholars were more interested in dust, like Mrs. Coulter and Lord Boreal and them. I see, said Father Coram. That's very interesting. Now, Lyra, said John Farr, I'm going to tell you something. Father Coram here, he's a wise man. He's a seer. He's been a follower in all what's been going on with Dust and the Gobblers and Lord Asriel and everything else. And he's been a follower in you. Every time the Costers went to Oxford, or half a dozen other families come to that, they brought back a bit of news about you, child. Did you know that? Lyra shook her head. She was beginning to be frightened. Pantalaimon was growling too deep for anyone to hear, but she could feel it in her fingertips down inside his fur. Oh, yes, said John Farr. All your doings, they all got back to Father Coram here. Lyra couldn't hold it in. We didn't damage it, honest. It was only a bit of mud, and we never got very far. What are you talking about, child? Said John Farr. Father Coram laughed. When he did that, his shaking stopped and his face became bright and young. But Lyra wasn't laughing. With trembling lips, she said, and even if we'd found the bung, we'd never take it out. It was just a joke. We wouldn't have sunk it, never. Then John Farr began to laugh too. He slapped a broad hand on the table so hard the glasses rang and his massive shoulders shook, and he had to wipe away the tears from his eyes. Lyra had never seen such a sight, never heard such a bellow. It was like a mountain laughing. Oh, yes, he said when he could speak again. We heard about that too, little girl. I don't suppose the Costers have set foot anywhere since then without being reminded of it. You better leave guard on your boat, Tony. People say, fierce little girls round here. Oh, that story went all over the fens, child. But we ain't going to punish you for it. No, ease your mind. He looked at Father Coram, and the two old men laughed again, but more gently, and Lyra felt contented and safe. Finally, John Farr shook his head and became serious again. I was saying, Lyra, as we knew about you from a child, from a baby, you ought to know what we know. I guess what they told you at Jordan College about where you come from, but they don't know the whole truth of it. Did they ever tell you who your parents were? Now Lyra was completely dazed. Yes, she said. They said Lord Asriel put me there because my mother and father died in an airship accident. That's what they told me. Ah, did they? Well, now, child, I'm going to tell you a story, a true story. I know it's true because Egyptian woman told me, and they all tell the truth to John Farr and Father Coram. So this is the truth about yourself, Lyra. Your father never perished in no airship accident because your father was Lord Asriel. Lyra could only sit in wonder. Here's how it came about, John Farr went on. When he was a young man, Lord Asriel went exploring all over the north and came back with great fortune. He was a high-spirited man, quick to anger, a passionate man. And your mother, she was passionate too. Not so well born as him, but a clever woman, a scholar even. And those who saw her said she was very beautiful. She and your father, they fell in love as soon as they met. The trouble was, your mother was already married. She'd married a politician. He was a member of the king's party, one of his closest advisors, a rising man. Now, when your mother found herself with child, she feared to tell her husband the child wasn't his. And when the baby was born, that's you, girl, it was clear from the look of you that you didn't favour her husband, but your true father. And she thought it best to hide you away and give out that you died. So you was taken to Oxfordshire, where your father had estates and put in the care of an Egyptian woman to nurse. But someone whispered to your mother's husband what had happened, and he came flying down and ransacked the cottage where the Egyptian woman had been. Only she'd fled to the great house, and your husband followed after in a murderous passion. Your father was out a-hunting, but they got word to him, and he came riding back in time to find your mother's husband at the foot of the great staircase. Another moment, and he'd have forced open the closet where the Egyptian woman was hiding with you. But Lord Asriel challenged him, and they fought there and then. And Lord Asriel killed him. The Egyptian woman heard and saw it all, Lyra, and that's how we know. The consequence was a great lawsuit. Your father ain't the kind of man to deny or conceal the truth, and it left the judges with a problem. He had killed all right. He'd shed blood. But he was defending his home and his child against an intruder. On the other hand, the law allows any man to avenge the violation of his wife, and the dead man's lawyers argued that he was doing just that. The case lasted for weeks with volumes of argument back and forth. In the end, the judges punished Lord Asriel by confiscating all his property and his land and left him a poor man, and he had been richer than a king. As for your mother, she wanted nothing to do with it, nor with you. She turned her back. The Egyptian nurse told me she'd often been afeard of how your mother would treat you, because she was a proud and scornful woman. So much for her. Then there was you. If things had fallen out different, Lyra, you might have been brought up Egyptian, because the nurse begged the court to let her have you, but we Egyptians got little standing in the law. The court decided you was to be placed in a priory, so you were, with the Sisters of Obedience at Watlington. You won't remember. The Lord Asriel wouldn't stand for that. He had a hatred of priors and monks and nuns, and being a high-handed man, he just rode in one day and carried you off. Not to look after you himself, nor to give you to Egyptians. He took you to Jordan College and dared the law to undo it. Well, the law let things be. Lord Asriel went back to his explorations, and you grew up at Jordan College. The one thing he said, your father, the one condition he made was that your mother shouldn't be let to see you. If she ever tried to do that, she was to be prevented, and he was to be told, because all the anger in his nature had turned against her now. The master promised faithfully to do that, and so time passed. Then come all this anxiety about dust, and all over the country, all over the world, wise men and women too began worrying about it. It weren't of any account to us Egyptians until they started taking our kids. That's when we got interested, and we got connections in all sorts of places you wouldn't imagine, including Jordan College. You wouldn't know, but there's been someone watching over you and reporting to us ever since you've been there, 'cause we got an interest in you. And that Egyptian woman who nursed you, she never stopped being anxious on your behalf. Well, who was watching over me? Said Lyra. She felt immensely important and strange that all her doings should be an object of concern so far away. It was a kitchen servant. It was Bernie Johansson, the pastry cook. He's half Egyptian, but you never know that, I'll be bound. Bernie was a kindly, solitary man, one of those rare people whose daemon was the same sex as himself. It was Bernie she had shouted at in her despair when Roger was taken, and Bernie had been telling the Egyptians everything. Oh, hang on, wait a minute. 1 second. It was a kitchen servant. It were Bernie Johansson, the pastry cook. He's half Egyptian. You'd never know that, I'll be bound. So Bernie was a kindly, solitary man, one of those rare people whose demon was the same sex as himself. It was Bernie she had shouted at in her despair when Roger was taken, and Bernie had been telling the Egyptians everything. She marvelled. So anyway, John Farr went on, we heard about you going away from Jordan College, and how it came about at a time when Lord Asriel was imprisoned and couldn't prevent it. And we remembered what he'd said to the master that he must never do, and we remembered that the man your mother had married, the politician Lord Asriel killed, was called Edward Coulter. Mrs. Coulter, said Lyra, quite stupefied. She ain't my mother. She is. And if your father had been free, she wouldn't never have dared to defy him, and you'd still be at Jordan, not knowing a thing. But what the master was doing letting you go is a mystery I can't explain. He was charged with your care. All I can guess is that she had some power over him. Lyra suddenly understood the master's curious behaviour on the morning she'd left. But he didn't want to, she said, trying to remember it exactly. I had to go and see him first thing that morning, and I mustn't tell Mrs. Coulter. It was like he wanted to protect me from Mrs. Coulter. She stopped and looked at the two men carefully and then decided to tell them the whole truth about the retiring room. See, there was something else. That evening I hid in the retiring room. I saw the master try to poison Lord Asriel. I saw him put some powder in the wine, and I told my uncle, and he knocked the decanter off the table and spilled it. So I saved his life. I could never understand why the master would want to poison him, because he was always so kind. Then on the morning I left, he called me in early to his study, and I had to go secretly so no one would know. And he said... Lyra racked her brains to try and remember exactly what it was the master had said. No good, she shook her head. The only thing I could understand was that he gave me something and I had to keep it secret from her, from Mrs. Coulter. Well, I suppose it's all right if I tell you. She felt in the pocket of the wolfskin coat and took out the velvet package. She laid it on the table and she sensed John Farr's massive, simple curiosity, and Father Corum's bright, flickering intelligence, both trained on her like searchlights. When she laid the alethiometer bare, it was Father Corum who spoke first. I never thought I'd ever set eyes on one of them again. That's a symbol reader. Did he tell you anything about it, child? No, only that I'd have to work out how to read it by myself, and he called it an alethiometer. What's that mean? Said John Farr, turning to his companion. That's a Greek word. I reckon it's from aletheia, which means truth. It's a truth measure. And have you worked out how to use it? He said to her. No, not least. Well, I can make the 3 shorthands point to the different pictures, but I can't do it with the long one. It goes all over. Except sometimes when I'm sort of concentrating, I can make the long needle go this way or that way just by thinking it. What's it do, Father Corum? Said John Farr. And how do you read it? Well, all these pictures round the rim, said Father Corum, holding it delicately towards John Farr's blunt, strong gaze. They're symbols, and each one stands for a whole series of things. We'll take the anchor there. The first meaning of that is hope, because hope holds you fast, like an anchor, so you don't give way. The second meaning is steadfastness. The third meaning is snag or prevention. The fourth meaning is the sea, and so on, down to the 10, 12, maybe a never-ending series of meanings. And do you know them all? Well, I know some, but to read it fully, I'd need a book. I've seen the book, I know where it is, but I ain't got it. Well, we'll come back to that, said John Farr. Go on. How do you read it? You've got 3 hands you can control, Father Corum explained, and you use them to ask a question by pointing to the 3 symbols. You can ask any question you can imagine because you've got so many levels on each one. Once you've got your question framed, the other needle swings round and points to more symbols that give you the answer. But how does it know what you're thinking when you set the question? Said John Farr. By itself it don't. It only works if the questioner holds the levels in their mind. You've got to know all the meanings first, and there must be 1,000 or more. And you've got to be able to hold them in your mind without fretting at it or pushing for an answer and just watch while the needle wanders. When it's gone round its full range, you'll know what the answer is. I know how it works because I've seen it done once by a wise man in Uppsala. And that's the only time I ever saw one before. Do you know how rare these are? Well, the master told me there was only 6 made, Lyra said. Whatever the number, it ain't large. And you kept this secret from Mrs. Coulter like the master told you, said John Farr. Yes, but a demon, right? He used to go in my room, and I'm sure he found it. I see. Well, Lyra, I don't know as we'll ever understand the full truth, but this is my guess, as good as I can make it. The master was given a charge by Lord Asriel to look after you and keep you safe from your mother. And that's what he did for 10 years or more. Then Mrs. Coulter's friends in the church helped her set up this oblation board for what purpose we don't know. And there she was, as powerful in a way as Lord Asriel was in his. Your parents, both strong in the world, both ambitious, and the Master of Jordan holding you in the balance between them. Now the Master, well, he's got 100 things to look after. His first concern is his college and the scholarship there. So, if he sees a threat to that, he has to move against it. And the church in recent times, Lyra, has been getting more commanding. There's councils of this, councils of that. There's talk of reviving the office of Inquisition, God forbid. And the Master has to tread warily between all these powers. He has to keep Jordan College on the right side of the church, or it won't survive. And another concern of the Master is you, child. Bernie Johansson was always clear about that. The Master of Jordan and the other scholars, they love you like their own child. They'd do anything to keep you safe, not just because they promised Lord Asriel that they would, but for your own sake. So, if the Master gave you up to Mrs. Coulter when he promised Lord Asriel he wouldn't, you must have thought you'd be safer with her than at Jordan College, in spite of all appearances. And when he set out to poison Lord Asriel, he must have thought that what Lord Asriel was doing would place them all in danger, and maybe all of us too, maybe all the world. I see the Master as a man having terrible choices to make. Whatever he chooses will do harm, but maybe if he does the right thing, a little less harm will come about than if he chooses wrong. Well, God preserve me from having to make any sort of choice like that. And when it comes to the point where he had to let you go, he gave you the symbol reader and bade you keep it safe. And I wonder what he had in mind for you to do with it, as you couldn't read it. I'm foxed as to what he was a-thinking. He said, oh, who's this? Oh, it's Lyra. He said Uncle Asriel presented the alethiometer to Jordan College years before, Lyra said, struggling to remember. He was going to say something else, and then someone knocked at the door and we had to stop. What I thought was he might have wanted me to keep it away from Lord Asriel too. Or even the opposite, said John Farr. What do you mean, John? Said Father Coram. Well, he might have had it in mind to ask Lyra to return it to Lord Asriel as a kind of recompense of trying to poison him. He might have thought the danger from Lord Asriel had passed, or that Lord Asriel could read some wisdom from this instrument and hold back from his purpose. If Lord Asriel was held captive now, it might help set him free. Well, Lyra, you better take this symbol reader and keep it safe. If you kept it safe so far, I ain't worried about leaving it with you. But there might come a time when we need to consult it, and I reckon we'll ask for it then. He folded the velvet over and slid it back across the table. Lyra wanted to ask all kinds of questions, but suddenly she felt shy of this massive man, with his little eyes so sharp and kindly among their folds and wrinkles. One thing she had to ask, though. Who was the Egyptian woman who nursed me? Why, it was Billy Costa's mother, of course. She wouldn't have told you, because I ain't let her, but she knows what we're talking of here, so it's all out in the open. Now, you best be getting back to her. You got plenty to be thinking of, child. When 3 days is gone past, we'll have another rope in and discuss all there is to do. You be a good girl. Good night, Lyra. Good night, Good night, Father Coram, she said politely, clutching the alethiometer to her breast with one hand and scooping up Pantalaimon with the other. Both old men smiled kindly at her. Outside the door of the parley room, Marcosta was waiting, and, as if nothing had happened since Lyra was born, the boat mother gathered her into her great arms and kissed her before bearing her off to bed. Chapter 8. Frustration. Lyra had to adjust to a new sense of her own story, and that couldn't be done in a day. To see Lord Asriel as her father was one thing, but to accept Mrs. Coulter as her mother was nowhere near as easy. A couple of months ago she would have rejoiced, of course, and she knew that too, and felt confused. But being Lyra, she didn't fret about it for long, for there was the Fen town to explore, and many Egyptian children to amaze. Before the 3 days were up, she was an expert with a punt, in her eyes at least, and she'd gather a gang of urchins about her with tales of her mighty father so unjustly made captive. And then one evening, the Turkish ambassador was a guest at Jordan for dinner, and he was under orders from the Sultan himself to kill my father right, and he had a ring on his finger with a hollow stone full of poison. And when the wine come round, he made as if to reach across my father's glass, and he sprinkled the poison in. It was done so quick that no one else saw him, but... What sort of poison? Demanded a thin-faced girl. Poison out of a special Turkish serpent, Lyra invented. What they catch by playing a pipe to lure it out, and then they throw it in a sponge soaked in honey, and the serpent bites it, and they can't get his fangs free, and they catch it and milk the venom out. Anyway, my father's seen what the Turk done, and he says, Gentlemen, I want to propose a toast to friendship between Jordan College and the College of Izmir. which was the college the Turkish ambassador belonged to, and to show our willingness to be friends, he says, we'll swap glasses and drink each other's wine. And the ambassador, well, he's in a fix then, because he couldn't refuse to drink without giving deadly insult, and he couldn't drink it because he knew it was poisoned. He went all pale, and he fainted right away at the table. And when he come round, they was all sitting there waiting and looking at him. And then he had to either drink the poison or own up. So what did he do? Well, he drunk it. It took him all 5 minutes to die, and he was in torment all the time. Did you see it happen? No. Girls, well, they ain't allowed at the high table, but I seen his body afterwards when they laid him out. His skin was all withered like an old apple, and his eyes were starting from his head. In fact, they had to push him back into his sockets, and so on. Meanwhile, around the edges of the fen country, the police were knocking at doors, searching attics and outhouses, inspecting papers and interrogating everyone who claimed to have seen a blonde little girl. And in Oxford, the search was even fiercer. Jordan College was scoured from the dustiest box room to the darkest cellar, and so were Gabriel and St. Michael's, till the heads of all the colleges issued a joint protest asserting their ancient rights. The only notion Lyra had of the search for her was the incessant drone of the gas engines, of airships crisscrossing the skies. They weren't visible because the clouds were low, and by statute, airships had to keep to a certain height above fen country. But who knew what cunning spy devices they might carry? Best to keep undercover when she heard them, or wear the oilskin sou'wester over her bright, distinctive hair. And she questioned Ma Costa about every detail of the story of her birth. She wove the details into a mental tapestry even clearer and sharper than the stories she made up, and lived over and over again the flight from the cottage, the concealment in the closet, the harsh-voiced challenge, the clash of swords. Swords? Great God, girl, you dreaming? Ma Costa said. Mr. Coulter had a gun, and Lord Asriel knocked it out his hand and struck him down with one blow. Then there was 2 shots. I wonder you don't remember. You ought to, little as you were. The first shot was Edward Coulter, who reached his gun and fired. And the second was Lord Asriel, who tore it out his grasp a second time and turned it on him, shot him right between the eyes and dashed his brains out. Then he says, cool as paint, come out, Ma Costa, and bring the baby, because, well, you were setting up such a howl, you and your demon both. And he took you up and dandled you, sat you on his shoulders, walking up and down in high good humour with a dead man at his feet, and called for wine and bade me swab the floor. By the end of the 4th repetition of the story, Lyra was perfectly convinced she did remember it, and even volunteered details of the colour of Mr. Coulter's coat and the cloaks and furs hanging in the closet. Ma Costa laughed. And whenever she was alone, Lyra took out the alethiometer and pored over it like a lover with a picture of the beloved. So each image had several meanings, did it? Why shouldn't she work them out? Wasn't she Lord Asriel's daughter? Remembering what Father Coram had said, she tried to focus her mind on 3 symbols taken at random and clicked the hands round to point at them. She found that if she held the alethiometer just so in her palms and gazed at it in a particularly lazy way as she thought of it, the long needle would begin to move more purposefully. Instead of its wayward divagations around the dial, it swung smoothly from picture to picture. Sometimes it would pause at 3, sometimes 2, sometimes 5 or more. And although she understood nothing of it, she gained a deep, calm enjoyment from it, unlike anything she'd known. Pantalaimon would crouch over the dial, sometimes as a cat, sometimes as a mouse, swinging his head round after the needle. And once or twice the 2 of them shared a glimpse of meaning that felt as if a shaft of sunlight had struck through the clouds to light up a majestic line of great hills in the distance, something far beyond, and never suspected. And Lyra thrilled at those times with the same deep thrill she'd felt all her life on hearing the word north. So the 3 days passed, with much coming and going between the multitude of boats and the Zal, and then came the evening of the 2nd roping. The hall was more crowded than before, if that was possible. Lyra and the Costas got there in time to sit at the front, and as soon as the flickering lights showed that the place was crammed, John Farr and Father Coram came out on the platform and sat behind the table. John Farr didn't have to make a sign for silence. He just put his great hands flat on the table and looked at the people below, and the hubbub died. "Well," he said, "you done what was asked, and better than I hoped. I'm a-going to call on the heads of the 6 families now to come up here and give over their gold and recount their promises. Nicholas Rugby, you come first." A stout, black-bearded man climbed onto the platform and laid a heavy leather bag on the table. "That's our gold," he said, "and we offer 38 men." "Thank you, Nicholas," said John Farr. Father Coram was making a note. The first man stood at the back of the platform as John Farr called for the next, and each came up, laid a bag on the table, and announced the number of men he could muster. The Costas were part of the Stefanski family, and naturally Tony had been one of the first to volunteer. Lyra noticed his hawk demon shifting from foot to foot and spreading her wings as the Stefanski money and promise of 23 men were laid before John Farr. When the 6 family heads had all come up, Father Coram showed his piece of paper to John Farr, who stood up to address the audience again. "Friends, that's a muster of 170 men. I thank you proudly. As for the gold, I make no doubt from the weight of it that you've all dug deep in your coffers, and my warm thanks go out for that as well. What we're going to do next is this. We're going to charter a ship and sail north and find them kids and set them free. From what we know, there might be some fighting to do. It won't be the first time, nor it won't be the last, but we never had a fight yet with people who kidnap children, and we shall have to be uncommon cunning. But we ain't going to come back without our kids. Yes, Dirk Vries." A man stood up and shouted, "Lord Farr, do you know why they captured them kids?" "We heard it's a theological matter. They're making an experiment, but what nature it is, we don't know. To tell you all the truth, we don't even know whether a harm is a-coming to 'em. But whatever it is, good or bad, they got no right to reach out by night and pluck little children out the hearts of their families. Yes, Raymond Van Gerrit." The man who had spoken at the first meeting stood up and said, "That child, Lord Farr, the one you spoke of being sought, that one is sitting in the front row now. I heard there's all the folk living around the edge of the fens having their houses turned upside down on her account. I heard there's a move in Parliament this very day to rescind our ancient privileges on account of this child. Yes, friends," he said over the babble of shocked whispers, "they were going to pass a law doing away with our right to free movement in and out of the fens. Now, Lord Farr, what we want to know is this. Who is this child on account of which we might have to come to such a pass? She ain't Egyptian child, not as I heard. How comes it is that a landloper child can put us all in danger?" Lyra looked up at John Farr's massive frame. Her heart was thumping so much she could hardly hear the first words of his reply. "Now spell it out, Raymond. Don't be shy," he said. "You want us to give this child up to them she's a-fleeing from, is that right?" The man stood obstinately frowning, but said nothing. "Well, perhaps you would, perhaps you wouldn't," John Farr continued. "But if any man or woman needs a reason for doing good, ponder on this. That little girl is a daughter of Lord Asriel, no less. For them as forgotten, it were Lord Asriel who interceded with the Turk for the life of Sam Brokeman. It were Lord Asriel who allowed Egyptian boats free passage on the canals through his property. It were Lord Asriel who defeated the Watercourse Bill in Parliament to our great and lasting benefit, and it were Lord Asriel who fought day and night in the floods of 53 and plunged headlong in the water twice to pull out young Rudd and Nellie Koopman. You forgotten that? Shame. Shame on you, shame. And now that same Lord Asriel is held in the farthest, coldest, darkest regions of the wild captive in the fortress of Svalbard, do I need to tell you the kind of creatures are gardening there? And this is his little daughter in our care, and Raymond Van Gerrit would hand her over to the authorities for a bit of peace and quiet. Is that right, Raymond? Stand up and answer, man." But Raymond Van Gerrit had sunk to his seat, and nothing would make him stand. A low hiss of disapproval sounded through the great hall, and Lyra felt the shame he must be feeling as well as a deep glow of pride in her brave father. John Farr turned away and looked at the other men on the platform. "Nicholas Rugby, I'm putting you in charge of finding a vessel and commanding her once we sail. Adam Stefanski, I want you to take charge of arms and munitions and command of fighting. Roger Van Poppel, You look to all the other stores from food to cold weather clothing. Simon Hartman, you be treasurer and account to us all for a proper apportionment of our gold. Benjamin dear Rutyer, I want you to take charge of spying. There's a great deal we ought to find out, and I'm giving you the charge of that, and you'll report to Far Decorum. Michael Canzona, you're going to be responsible for coordinating the first 4 leaders' work. You'll report to me, and if I die, you're my second in command, and you'll take over. Now, I made my dispositions according to custom, and if any man or woman seeks to disgrace, they may do so. And if any man or woman seeks to disagree, they may do so freely. After a moment, a woman stood up. Lord Farr, ain't you taking any women on this expedition to look after them kids once you found them? No, we shall have little space as is. Any kids we free will be better off in our care than where they've been. But supposing you find out that you can't rescue them without some women in disguise as guards or nurses or whatever. Well, I hadn't thought of that, John Farr admitted. We'll consider that most carefully when we retire into the parley room. You have my promise. She sat down and the man stood up. Lord Farr, I heard you say that Lord Asriel is in captivity. Is it part of your plan to rescue him? Because if it is, and if he's in the power of them bears, as I think you said, that's going to need more than 170 men. And good friends as Lord Asriel is to us, I don't know as there's any call on us to go as far as that. Adrian Brax, you're not wrong. What I had it in mind to do was to keep our eyes and ears open and see what knowledge we can glean while we're in the north. It may be that we can do something to help him, and it may not. But you can trust me not to use what we provided, man and gold, for any purpose outside the stated one of finding our children and bringing them home. Another woman stood up. Lord Farr, we don't know what them gobblers might have been doing to our children. We all heard rumours and stories of fearful things. We hear about children with no heads, or about children cut in half and sewn together, or about things too awful to mention. I'm truly sorry to distress anyone, but we all heard this kind of thing, and I want to get it out in the open. Now, in case you find anything of that awful kind, Lord Farr, I hope you are going to take a powerful revenge. I hope you ain't going to let thoughts of mercy and gentleness hold your hand back from striking hard, and delivering a mighty blow to the heart of that infernal wickedness. And I'm sure I speak for any mother who has lost a child to the gobblers. There was a loud murmur of agreement as she sat down. Heads were nodding all over the Zal. John Farr waited for silence and said, Nothing will hold my hand, Margaret, save only judgment. If I stay my hand in the north, it will only be to strike the harder in the south. To strike a day too soon is as striking 100 miles off. To be sure, there's warm passion behind what you say, but if you give in to that passion, friends, you're doing what I always warned you again. You're replacing the satisfaction of your own feelings above the work you have to do. Our work here is first rescue, then punishment. It ain't gratification for upset feelings. Our feelings don't matter. If we rescue the kids, we can't punish the gobblers. We've done the main task. If we rescue the kids, but we can't punish the gobblers, we've done the main task. But if we aim to punish the gobblers first, and by doing so lose the chance of rescuing the kids, we've failed. But be assured of this, Margaret. When the time comes to punish, we shall strike such a blow as will make their hearts faint and fearful. We shall strike the strength out of them. We shall leave them ruined and waste and broken and shattered and torn in 1,000 pieces, scattered to the 4 winds. My own hammer is thirsty for blood, friends. She ain't tasted blood since I slew the Tartar champion on the steppes of the Kazakhstan. She's been a-hanging in my boat and dreaming, but she can smell blood in the wind from the north. She spoke to me last night and told me of her thirst, and I said, soon, gal, soon. Margaret, you can worry about 100 things. Margaret, you can worry about 100 things, but don't you worry that John Farr's heart is too soft to strike a blow when the time comes. And the time will come under judgment, not under passion. Is there anyone else who wants to speak? Speak if you will. But no one did. And presently John Farr reached for the closing bell and rang it hard and loud, swinging it high and shaking the peals out of it so that they filled the hall and rang the rafters. John Farr and the other men left the platform for the parley room. Lyra was a little disappointed. Didn't they want her there too? But Tony laughed. They got plans to make, he said. You done your part, Lyra. Now it's for John Farr and the council. But I ain't done nothing yet, Lyra protested as she followed the others reluctantly out of the hall and down the cobbled road towards the jetty. All I've done was run away from Mrs. Coulter. That's just the beginning. I want to go north. Tell you what, said Tony. I'll bring you back a walrus tooth. That's what I'll do. Lyra scowled. For his part, Pantalaimon occupied himself by making monkey faces at Tony's demon, who closed her tawny eyes in disdain. Lyra drifted to the jetty and hung about with her new companions, dangling lanterns on strings over the black water to attract the goggle-eyed fishes who swam slowly up to be lunged at with sharp sticks, and missed. But her mind was on John Farr in the parley room. Before long she slipped away up the cobbles again to the Zal. There was a light in the parley room window. It was too high to look through, but she could hear a low rumble of voices inside. So she walked up to the door and knocked on it firmly 5 times. The voices stopped. A chair scraped across the floor and the door opened, spilling warm naphtha light out on the dark step. Yes, said the man who opened it. Beyond him, Lyra could see the other men around the table with bags of gold stacked neatly and papers and pens and glasses and a crock of Geneva. I want to come north, said Lyra, so that they could all hear it. I want to come and help rescue the kids. That's what I set out to do when I ran away from Mrs. Coulter. And before that, I meant to rescue my friend Roger, the kitchen boy from Jordan, who was took. I want to come and help. I can do navigation and I can take ambaromagnetic readings off of the Aurora, and I know what parts of a bear you can eat, and all kinds of useful things. You'd be sorry if you got up there and then you found that you needed me, and you'd be sorry if you got up there and then found you needed me and found you left me behind. And like that woman said, you might need women to play a part. Well, you might need kids too. You don't know, so you ought to take me, Lord Farr. Excuse me for interrupting your talk. She was inside the room now, and all the men and their demons were watching her, some with amusement and some with irritation. But she had eyes only for John Farr. Pantalaimon sat up in her arms, his wildcat eyes blazing green. John Farr said, Lyra, there ain't no question of taking you into danger, so don't you delude yourself, child. Stay here and help Ma Coster and keep safe. That's what you got to do. But I'm learning how to read the alethiometer too. It's coming clearer every day. Look, you're bound to need that. Bound to. He shook his head. No, he said. I know your heart was set on going north, but it's my belief not even Mrs. Coulter was going to take you. If you want to see the north, you'll have to wait till all this trouble's over. Now, off you go. Pantalaimon hissed quietly, but John Farr's demon took off from the back of his chair and flew at them with black wings, not threateningly, but like a reminder of good manners, and Lyra turned on her heel as the crow glided over her head and wheeled back to John Farr. The door shut behind her with a decisive click. We will go, she said to Pantalaimon. Let him try and stop us. We will. Chapter 9. Spies. The Spies. Got 6 or so minutes, so let's see where we get up to. Over the next few days, Lyra concocted a dozen plans and did miss them impatiently, but they all boiled down to stowing away. And how could you stow away on a narrow boat? To be sure, the real voyage would involve a proper ship, and she knew enough stories to expect all kinds of hiding places on a full-size vessel. The lifeboats, the hold, the bilges, whatever they were. But she'd have to get to the ship first, and leaving the fens meant travelling the Egyptian way. And even if she got to the coast on her own, she might stow away on the wrong ship. It would be a fine thing to hide in a lifeboat and wake up on the way to High Brazil. Meanwhile, all around her, the tantalising work of assembling the expedition was going on day and night. She hung around Adam Stefanski, watching as he made his choice of the volunteers for the fighting force. She pestered Roger Van Poppel with suggestions about the stores they needed to take. Had he remembered snow goggles? Did he know the best place to get Arctic maps? The man she most wanted to help was Benjamin de Rutya, the spy, but he had slipped away in the early hours of the morning after the second roping, and naturally no one could say where he had gone, or when he had returned. So, in default, Lyra attached herself to Father Coram. "I think it'd be best if I helped you, Father Coram," she said, "because I probably know more about the gobblers than anyone else, being as I was nearly one of them. Probably you'll need me to help you understand Mr. de Rutya's messages." He took pity on the fierce, desperate little girl and didn't send her away. Instead, he talked to her and listened to her memories of Oxford and of Mrs. Coulter and watched as she read the alethiometer. "Where's that book with all the symbols in?" she asked him one day. "In Heidelberg," he said. "And is there just one?" "Well, there may be others, but that's the one I've seen." "I bet there's one in Bodley's library in Oxford," she said. She could hardly take her eyes off Father Coram's demon, who was the most beautiful demon she'd ever seen. When Pantalaimon was a cat, he was lean and ragged and harsh, but Sophonax, for that was her name, was golden-eyed and elegant beyond measure, fully twice as large as a real cat and richly furred. When the sunlight touched her, it lit up more shades of tawny brown leaf hazel, corn, gold, autumn, mahogany than Lyra could name. She longed to touch that fur, to rub her cheeks against it, but of course she never did, for it was the grossest breach of etiquette imaginable to touch another person's demon. Demons might touch each other, of course, or fight, but the prohibition against human-demon contact went so deep that even in battle, no warrior would touch an enemy's demon. It was utterly forbidden. Lyra couldn't remember having to be told that. She just knew it, as instinctively as she felt that nausea was bad and comfort good. So although she admired the fur of Sophonax, and even speculated on what it might feel like, she never made the slightest move to touch her, and never would. Sophonax was as sleek and healthy and beautiful as Father Coram was ravaged and weak. He might have been ill, or he might have suffered a crippling blow, but the result was that he could not walk without leaning on 2 sticks, and he trembled constantly like an aspen leaf. His mind was sharp and clear and powerful, though, and soon Lyra came to love him for this, and soon Lyra came to love him for his knowledge and for the firm way he directed her. What's the hourglass mean, Father Coram?" she asked over the alethiometer one sunny morning in his boat. "It keeps coming back to that." "There's often a clue there if you look more close. What's that little old thing on top of it?" She screwed her eyes up and peered. "That's a skull." "So, what do you think that might mean?" "Death? Is that death?" "That's right. So in the hourglass range of meanings, you get death. In fact, after time, which is the first one? Death is the second one." "Do you know what I noticed, Father Coram? The needle stops there on the second go round. On the first round, it kind of twitches, and on the second, it stops. Is that saying it's the second meaning, then?" "Probably. What are you asking at, Lyra?" "I'm thinking..." She stopped, surprised to find that she had actually been asking a question without realising it. "I just put 3 pictures together because I was thinking about Mr. de Rutya, see, and I put together the serpent and the crucible and the beehive to ask as how he's getting on with his spine, and..." "Why them 3 symbols?" "Well, because I thought the serpent was cunning, like a spy ought to be, and the crucible could mean, like, knowledge, what you kind of distill, and the beehive was hard work, like bees are always working hard, so out of the hard work and the cunning comes the knowledge, see? And that's the spy's job." And then I pointed to them, and I thought the question in my mind, and the needle stopped at death. Do you think that could be really working, Father Coram?" "It's working all right, Lyra. What we don't know is whether we're reading it right. That's a subtle art, and I wonder if..." Before he could finish his sentence, there was an urgent knock at the door, and a young Egyptian man came in. "Beg pardon, Father Coram. There's Jacob Huysmans just come back, and he's sore wounded." "He was with Benjamin de Rutya," said Father Coram. "What's happened?" "Well, he won't speak," said the young man. "You better come, Father Coram, because he won't last long. He's a bleeding inside." Father Coram and Lyra exchanged a look of alarm and wonderment, but only for a second, and then Father Coram was hobbling out on his sticks as fast as he could manage, with his demon padding ahead of him. Lyra came too, hopping with impatience. The young man led them to a boat tied up at the sugar beet jetty, where a woman in a red flannel apron held open the door for them. Seeing her suspicious glance at Lyra, Firecorn said, "It's important the girl hears what Jacob's got to say, mistress." So the woman let them in and stood back with her squirrel demon perched silent on the wooden clock. On a bunk under a patchwork coverlet lay a man whose white face was damp with sweat and whose eyes were glazed. "I've sent for this physician, Father Coram," said the woman shakily. "Please don't agitate him. He's in an agony of pain. He come off in Peter Horker's boat just a few minutes ago." "Where's Peter now?" There we go. Oh, there we are. Cliffhanger. Sweet. Oh, it's really good reading this again, because I've forgotten so much of it. But looking forward to see what happens, and yeah, how Lyra's going to do it, how she's going to get north. So that's that for this episode. As ever with Speedy Reads, mistakes, mispronunciations, blunders, but that's the nature of just reading. So I hope you enjoyed it, and tune in next time for the next episode of Phillip Pullman's Northern Lights. Until then, be brilliant. Bye.
Above there are no stars tonight, just northern skies, reflected light upon your face. Some people think stars rule our lives, some people they think otherwise, they can be replaced.